On August 12, 2016, exactly 365 days after the scientific expedition disappeared without a trace, a Peruvian river police patrol noticed a strange object on the muddy riverbank near the village of Boca, Colorado. In the mud, at the very edge of the water, was what the officers initially thought was the corpse of a large animal or a pile of garbage thrown up by the current after a storm. As the boat got closer, it became clear that it was a person. The woman who had once been human now resembled a broken doll. She was barefoot, wearing a dirty men's t-shirt several sizes too big, and her head was roughly shaved with a dull blade, covered with festering abrasions and deep cuts. She did not respond to the loud noise of the motor, only trembled, staring glassy-eyed at a single point on the opposite bank. When one of the officers tried to touch her shoulder, she let out a sound that didn't sound like a human scream at all. It was the dry, throaty howl of a cornered animal. It was Emily Clark, the only one who returned from the green hell alive, and what she would tell investigators later would make everyone shudder with horror. On August 10, 2015, a private plane landed at the airport in Puerto Maldonado in southeastern Peru. A group of 5 people stepped out, looking strikingly different from the typical tourists in shorts and Panamas who usually flood the region in search of exoticism. They were professionals, equipped with the latest technology, and their goal had nothing to do with recreation. Officially, it was called a scientific expedition, but the level of funding and support indicated something more. The sponsor was the pharmaceutical giant Ethelgard Biopharma, a multi-billion-dollar corporation that rarely invested resources in simple field research without the guarantee of super profits. The head of the group was 32-year-old David Ross, a well-known ethnobotanist in narrow circles who specialized in the flora of the Amazon. His right-hand man in matters of science was Emily Clark, 25 years old, a talented biochemist whose narrow specialization was complex plant alkaloids. Her knowledge was key to the success of the mission. 29-year-old Michael Chen, a field medic with experience in war zones, was responsible for the team's health. 27-year-old Sarah O'Neill provided navigation and mapping. The 5th team member, whose presence raised the most questions from local guides, was 35-year-old Jason Torres, a security and logistics specialist and former military officer who never left the containers of equipment. Their task was to collect samples of rare flora in the upper reaches of the Las Piedras River. This is an area bordering closed territories inhabited by non-contact tribes, and where outsiders are strictly prohibited from entering. Unlike budget researchers who rent old wooden boats, the group traveled on a specially equipped aluminum boat with a reinforced hull and a powerful engine, delivered by cargo flight the day before their arrival. The last documented location of the group was recorded on August 12, 2015. They were staying at the Green Canopy Outpost Eco Lodge, the last bastion of civilization before the wild jungle. The lodge manager, a man named Hector, would later testify to investigators. He remembered the group because of their reclusiveness and the large number of sealed containers they refused to leave unattended, even during breakfast. Hector made a note in the guest registration book with his own hand. Departure of Ross's group, August 12th, 7:30 in the morning. Direction, upstream. These were the last people to see the 5 alive. According to Ethelgard Biopharma's security protocol, the team leader, David Ross, was to contact the team via a BGAN satellite terminal every 48 hours. The first session was successful, and the second was also. But on August 17th, 5 days after leaving the lodge, the terminal went silent. When the group missed the backup time for contact, The corporate headquarters did not wait for the bureaucratic procedures of the Peruvian police. The management realized that in the jungle, time is not measured in hours, but in chances of survival. On August 18, 2015, Ethelgard Biopharma signed a contract with the private military company Century Global. The task was clear: to find people and, more importantly, equipment and samples. The budget for the search and rescue operation was virtually unlimited. 2 helicopters equipped with military-grade thermal imagers and the LiDAR system capable of scanning the terrain through the dense foliage of the rainforest were deployed to the area of the disappearance. The unmanned aerial vehicles monitored the area of the suspected disappearance of 150 square kilometers around the clock. The leaders of the search operation decided not to use sniffer dogs. Dogs would have been ineffective in the conditions of 100% humidity, heat, and an incredible amount of wild animal scents. They relied on technology and human resources. Century Global mercenaries, armed and trained for tropical survival, combed the coastline meter by meter. They checked every backwater, every abandoned fisherman's hut. The operation lasted 4 months. It was 120 days of continuous scanning of the green hell. The result was scanty and at the same time disturbing. On August 23rd, the 6th day of the search, one of the drones detected an anomaly in a remote bay 40 kilometers from the planned route of the expedition. The rapid response team that landed on the spot found a boat. It was the same reinforced aluminum boat on which the group had left the lodge. It was half submerged and carefully hidden under overhanging tree branches. Inspection of the vessel only added to the questions. The engine had been removed, the navigation equipment uprooted, and the identification numbers on the hull had been roughly cut off with an angle grinder. It didn't look like an accident or an attack by wild animals. Someone had spent a lot of time and effort to turn a high-tech vehicle into a pile of scrap and hide its identity. Not a single personal item was found inside. Not a single trace of blood or struggle. The people simply disappeared, leaving behind only an empty metal shell. In December of 2015, when the rainy season made further searches impossible and costs exceeded all reasonable limits, Ethelgard Biopharma ordered the active phase of the operation to be wound down. The official report showed no evidence of the survival of the expedition members. The families received generous insurance payments in exchange for their silence, and the files of the 5 specialists were moved to the archive. The jungle swallowed them up, leaving not even their bodies for burial. The Las Piedras River continued to carry its waters, reliably guarding the secret of what happened between August 12th and 17th. But silence is deceiving, and sometimes what is thought to be dead and lost forever comes back to tell a story that no one is ready to hear. On August 12, 2016, exactly 365 days after the last trace of David Ross's group disappeared into the green abyss, a routine day for the Manu Provincial Police Patrol turned into a scene from a horror movie. At 14 hours and 15 minutes, the crew of a riverboat making a routine patrol near the mining community of Boca, Colorado, spotted a suspicious object in a muddy shoal. At first, the officers, exhausted by the 40-degree heat and the monotonous hum of the engine, mistook the discovery for the corpse of a large animal, possibly a tapir or capybara, which are often thrown up by the current after seasonal rains. The object lay motionless, half submerged in viscous gray clay, just 10 feet from the water's edge. Vultures had already begun to gather around it, circling in the hot air, anticipating prey. As the boat drew closer and the officers turned off the engine, the silence was broken not by the smell of decomposition, but by a barely audible hoarse moan. What appeared to be a pile of dirty rags stirred. One of the patrolmen, his hand on his holster, cautiously stepped onto the shaky ground of the bank. When he got within 5 feet, the object looked up sharply. It was a man, or what was left of it. In front of the police sat a woman whose appearance shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers who had seen the aftermath of jungle gang violence. She was extremely emaciated. Her skin literally covered her bones, resembling parchment. She looked to weigh no more than 80 pounds. Her face, once young, had become a mask of pain and despair, covered with festering sores from insect bites and tropical infections. The most striking thing was her head. There was no hair. The head had been shaved, and it was done extremely crudely, probably with a dull knife or a piece of glass. The entire scalp was covered with a network of deep cuts, which had already begun to crust over, and old scars. The clothes she wore only emphasized the surrealism of the picture. A dirty, dark green men's t-shirt that was 3 or 4 sizes too big and hung from her thin shoulders like a shroud. On her feet were strange homemade sandals woven from coarse vegetable fibers and pieces of synthetic rope that had eaten into the skin of her ankles. When the officer took a step toward her, extending his hand to help, the woman reacted instantly and fearfully. She did not speak or ask for help. Instead, she recoiled, pressing her back into the mud, and made a sound that the police report would later describe as an animal howl of absolute terror. Her eyes, unnaturally large on her emaciated face, were dilated with panic, and her hands were randomly covering her head as if she was expecting a blow. She could not walk. Her leg muscles were so atrophied that they could not support the weight of even her emaciated body. The officers had to carry her to the boat in their arms, while she continued to shudder at every touch, as if her skin was burning with fire. At 16 hours and 30 minutes, she was taken to the nearest medical center, where doctors were able to conduct an initial examination. The medical report was a dry list of horrors. In addition to the severe degree of dystrophy and dehydration, the woman's body was a torture map. On her wrists and neck, doctors recorded characteristic deep furrows with necrotic tissue, traces of prolonged wearing of heavy metal shackles or chains. The skin on her back and thighs was covered with rounded burns, similar to cigarette burns, and long scars from blows. A gynecological examination confirmed the worst fears. The woman had been subjected to systematic and brutal sexual violence for a long time. Identification became a problem. The woman was in a state of deep psychological shock and did not say a word. She was only rocking on the bed, looking at one point. The woman was identified only through fingerprinting. The fingerprints were run through the database of missing foreigners. The result, obtained at 20 o'clock in the evening of the same day, stunned the investigators. The person found was Emily Clark, a biochemist on the missing Ethelgard Biopharma expedition. She was 25 years old at the time of her disappearance. The photo of the smiling girl in her personnel file had nothing to do with the broken creature lying in a hospital bed in the middle of nowhere in Peru. The information that the girl from the jungle had been found alive leaked to Ethelgard Biopharma's management instantly. The corporation's reaction was swift and fierce. 2 days later, on August 14, 2016, a convoy of private security guards and company representatives arrived at the modest hospital. They presented documents that authorized the immediate medical evacuation of the United States citizen. Under the cover of night, in strict secrecy, Emily Clark was loaded into a specialized ambulance. The local police and hospital staff were strongly advised to forget what they had seen. backed up by generous donations for infrastructure development and non-disclosure agreements. She was transported to an elite private clinic in Lima, where an entire floor was dedicated to her care and protection. For 2 days, the world did not know that one of the 5 disappeared had returned. In a sterile room crammed with equipment, Emily Clark slept on clean sheets for the first time in a year. But even in her sleep, her body continued to shake, and sensors recorded an off-the-charts level of stress. She had survived hell, but the silence she kept was heavier than any screams. The doctors fought for her physical recovery, but everyone realized that the main battle was ahead. Her inflamed brain held the answers to the questions about the fate of the other 4 members of the group, and the truth she was hiding behind her silence was more terrible than death itself. Friends, before we continue to dive into this gruesome story, I want to ask you one simple but important thing. YouTube's algorithms work in such a way that without your activity, this video will simply get lost among thousands of others. Therefore, if you are interested in this format and want to see the investigations continue, please subscribe to the channel right now. Click on the bell. Like and comment below this video. It will take you a few seconds, but it will help promote the content so that as many people as possible can learn the truth about events that are often silenced. Thank you for your support, and now let's get back to the case file. The silence in room 305 of a private clinic in Lima lasted exactly 21 days. For 3 weeks, doctors fought for Emily Clark's physical survival, slowly pulling her out of a deep catatonic stupor. All this time, not only doctors, but also representatives of the security service of Ethelgard Biopharma Corporation were on duty at her bedside, recording every word that came out of the patient's delirious mouth. But there was no coherent speech. There were only screams. The situation changed on September 6, 2016. In the presence of 2 special agents from the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation and a senior investigator from the Peruvian police, Emily Clark looked into the eyes of her interlocutors with a meaningful look for the first time. What she told them over the next 4 hours of interrogation completely overturned all previous theories. The version that the group had gotten lost, been the victim of an accident or an attack by wild tribes, crumbled to dust. The reality turned out to be much more terrifying than any natural threats to the Amazon. According to Emily's documented testimony, the fateful turn in the fate of the expedition occurred on August 14, 2015. The group, moving along the sample collection route, deviated from the riverbed deep into the jungle. At about 11 o'clock in the morning, they came to an unnaturally flat area, wading through dense thickets. It was not a clearing, it was a clearing, perfectly aligned and hidden from observation from the air by camouflage nets stretched between the crowns of tall trees. The scientists were presented with a picture that no one else could see. An unmarked Cessna light aircraft was parked on an improvised runway. People in military camouflage were bustling around it, loading white rectangular briquettes on board in a coordinated fashion. David Ross's expedition had accidentally stumbled upon a drug-trafficking transshipment point, a secret airfield that was part of the cocaine supply chain to Bolivia. There was no time to retreat. The security guards spotted the group instantly. There was no warning, no order to stop. The militants opened fire to kill. The first bullets hit the target. Jason Torres, a security specialist who was walking first, was shot in the right shoulder and fell, dropping his rifle. Panic gripped the group, but there was no escape. They were surrounded in less than a minute. 8 armed men laid the scientists face down in the dirt, holding them at gunpoint. Emily described what happened next with the mechanical precision of someone who had experienced this moment in nightmares hundreds of times. The militants examined the wounded Jason Torres. He was conscious, but losing a lot of blood. One of the men, whom Emily identified as a security commander, said something briefly in Spanish. The meaning of the phrase was clear. A wounded prisoner is an unnecessary burden that slows down movement. They did not try to treat Jason Torres. He was not interrogated. He was simply eliminated. Emily heard a single gunshot. Jason was shot in the back of the head right there on the edge of the runway, in front of his colleagues. It was a show execution to break the will of the others. Afterwards, the 4 survivors, David, Michael, Sarah, and Emily, were roughly searched. Their hands tied behind their backs with plastic ties and placed over their heads in thick burlap bags that smelled of mold and chemicals. They were thrown into the back of a truck like garbage bags. The trip lasted about 3 or 4 hours. Emily recalled the unbearable heat, the suffocation under the sack, and the constant bumps against the metal bottom of the truck on the potholes of the eroded forest road. When the car stopped and they were pulled out, the sound of the jungle changed. It was quieter, but there was a heavy smell of diesel fuel and chlorine in the air. When the bags were removed, the prisoners saw that they were not in an ordinary guerrilla camp. It was a well-fortified base, partially built into a natural network of caves and sinkholes. The entrances to the bunkers were camouflaged by vegetation and concrete. It was here that Emily first saw the man who would decide their fate. He was a middle-aged man with a cold, judgmental gaze who spoke Spanish with a distinctive accent typical of people from certain regions of Colombia. His subordinates addressed him with a mixture of fear and respect. They did not call him by name, only by his nickname, El Cirujano, which means the surgeon. Emily did not understand the full meaning of this word in the context of this place. She thought it was just a gang call sign. But when the surgeon approached them and began to examine the prisoners, he was not looking for weapons or money. He felt their muscles, checked their teeth, and looked into their eyes the way a farmer examines cattle before slaughter. And at that moment, Emily realized that drugs were just a side business for this man. The conditions in which the 4 surviving members of the expedition found themselves defied any logic of military captivity or standard kidnapping for ransom. According to the transcript of Emily Clark's interrogation, the place resembled not a prison but a cattle farm, where human life had value only as long as it could bring profit or pleasure. They were kept in 3 cramped cages welded together from rough, rusty rebar, standing in the open air under a leaky shed. The structure was so low that an adult could not stand upright in it. The floor was compacted earth, which during tropical downpours turned into a muddy mess teeming with insects. The daily routine in the camp was based on exhaustion. The men, team leader David Ross and medic Michael Chen, were pulled out of their cages every morning to work in the so-called kitchen. It was a primitive open-air laboratory where coca leaves were turned into cocaine paste. Emily described how her colleagues, intellectuals and scientists, were forced to carry 50-liter plastic barrels of precursors such as kerosene, sulfuric acid, and lime for hours at a time. They worked without protective clothing, barefoot, in fumes of toxic substances. Within a week, the skin on their arms and legs was covered with chemical burns that did not heal in the humid climate, and their eyes were constantly watering from the acrid fumes. Emily's fate was different, but no less horrific. She was not forced to work in drug production. She became a trophy for the cartel militants, a living toy used to reward the most loyal soldiers. A surgeon, the leader of the group, cynically called it maintaining morale. Emily told the investigators about it in dry, short sentences, looking at the wall, as if these events were happening to someone else, not to her. She had become a thing that was passed from hand to hand, property that had no right to a voice or resistance. But the most frightening discovery for the captives was that the drugs were just a screen for the surgeon's real, much more lucrative business. Emily claimed that the cartel was using the prisoners as more than just slaves. She began to notice strange details that didn't fit the picture of a typical drug lab. Heavy equipment powered by powerful diesel generators was periodically brought to the base. The air around one of the camouflaged concrete bunkers smelled not of gasoline or acid, but of sterility, a mixture of alcohol, chlorine, and a specific ozone odor. The nightmare became a reality one night that Emily remembered for the rest of her life. It happened about a month after their capture. An SUV arrived at the camp and unloaded several specialized medical containers, portable refrigerators with biohazard markings, which are usually used for transplantation. Around 2 a.m, the surgeon himself approached the cages, accompanied by 2 armed assistants. They opened the cage where the men were being held and pulled Michael Chen out. The doctor, who immediately recognized the specific containers and understood the purpose of the equipment, began to resist with the strength of a doomed man. Emily, whose testimony was recorded on audio tape, relayed the surgeon's words that night. He spoke calmly, as if he were discussing the logistics of an ordinary product. "I have a very impatient customer in São Paulo who needs fresh material urgently. You are the perfect match for the blood type." Michael was crying. He was a doctor and knew exactly what was coming. He was not being taken to the firing squad. He was being taken to be dismembered. Emily saw him being dragged into a lighted bunker. After a while, the generators were turned on at full power to drown out any sounds, but inhuman screams still broke through the roar of the engines, which lasted for about 40 minutes until they were replaced by silence. In the morning, the containers were loaded onto an airplane, which took off immediately. Michael Chen never returned to his cell. The atmosphere in the camp changed. The prisoners realized that they were not just labor, but walking sets of spare parts that were stored until needed. Sarah O'Neill was the next to be taken. She was taken a week after Michael. This time it happened during the day. Sarah did not resist. She was in a state of deep shock and went to the bunker meekly, like a sheep to the slaughter. It was at this point that David Ross, the leader of the expedition, broke down. When he saw Sarah being led away, he threw himself in a fit of despair on the bars of his cell, trying to break the rusty bars and shouting at the guards to take him instead. His rebellion was short-lived. 3 militants burst in and severely beat him with rifle butts. They broke both his legs and several ribs, turning him into a bloody mess. But the surgeon forbade them to kill him. He came up with another punishment for David. Ross was left in a cage, forbidden to give him food and water. In the 40-degree heat and high humidity, it was a slow and painful execution. Emily, who was in a nearby cell, was forced to watch her friend and mentor slowly die of dehydration and painful shock. He was delirious, asking for water, but the guards just laughed, pouring the precious liquid on the ground in front of his nose. David Ross died on the 5th day. His body was simply dragged out and dumped into a ravine outside the camp perimeter like waste material. Emily herself was left alive for one reason, which was as cynical as everything else in the place. One of the cartel's lieutenants, a man named Mateo, liked her. He convinced the surgeon that the girl could be useful for the camp's entertainment and domestic needs until a specific order came in for her. This shaky intercession gave her life, but turned it into an endless nightmare of waiting. Every time she heard the sound of an airplane engine or the roar of a generator near the medical bunker, she knew that another batch of goods was ready to be shipped, and one day she would be the one to receive them. And then, one evening, the surgeon approached her cell not with guards, but with a medical record in his hands. Emily Clark's interrogation, which took place in the sterile atmosphere of a private clinic room in Lima, was like trying to put together a broken mirror with your bare hands. Her testimony was chaotic, torn apart by panic attacks and memory lapses caused by post-traumatic stress disorder and the effects of strong sedatives. She could talk for hours about the color of the rust on the bars of her cell or the ants crawling up her legs. But when it came to geography or landmarks, she would shut down. Her brain blocked out memories of the place where she died as a person and was born as a thing. However, investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and security analysts from Ethelgard Biopharma Corporation realized that time was working against them. Every hour of delay gave the criminals a chance to cover their tracks if they had not already left the base. The breakthrough came on the 5th day of interrogation, when Emily recalled a visual detail that had become her anchor in reality during the long months of captivity. She said that from the corner where her cell stood, a tiny patch of sky opened up through a gap in the leaky canopy. It was the only thing she could see outside her iron box, and against the background of this sky, rising above the green sea of the jungle, stood a strange rock. Emily described it with manic precision, a gray limestone massif that resembled a giant molar tooth, split in half by a lightning strike or an ancient earthquake. This split tooth became her only reference point in space, a mute witness to her daily suffering. In addition to the visual image, Emily's memory retained other important details, such as sounds and smells, which for experienced analysts were more eloquent than GPS coordinates. She recalled the specific rhythm of camp life. Regularly, exactly every 3 days, the silence of the jungle was broken by a low, vibrating hum. It was not the sound of car engines or chainsaws. Experts identified this description as the work of heavy industrial diesel generators of high power. This fact was critical. An ordinary drug lab in the jungle does not require that much energy. The generators were run at full capacity exactly once every 3 days, and they worked for several hours without a break. This correlated perfectly with the testimony about the medical bunkers and refrigeration equipment that needed stable power to store the recovered organs. In addition, Emily clearly remembered a pungent, sweet chemical odor that permeated the camp on the days of the plane's arrival. It was not the smell of gasoline used to fuel boats. It was the smell of aviation kerosene, a high-octane fuel used by turboprop airplanes. Having received this fragmentary data, Ethelgard Biopharma's security service used resources that were not available to the regular police. The corporation rented the time of commercial remote sensing satellites, equipped with ultra-high-resolution optics. The task was titanic: to scan the terrain within 100 kilometers of the alleged location of the group's capture. The analytical department worked around the clock. Specialized software processed gigabytes of topographic data, looking for geological formations that matched Emily's description. The Amazon jungle is thousands of square miles of monotonous greenery that hides any terrain features, but the split tooth was too distinctive. On September 15, 2016, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the system produced a match with a 98% probability. The geological formation in the form of a bifurcated rock was discovered in a wild, inaccessible area near an unnamed tributary of the Inambara River. It was a blind spot on the maps, an area where there were no official settlements, roads, or tourist routes. The rock towered above the treetops, just as the victim had described. But finding the rock was only half the battle. We had to find the base itself. Satellite optical cameras were powerless against the triple layer of rainforest that reliably hid everything on the ground. That's when multispectral analysis technologies and thermal imagers came into play. The analysts focused on a sector within a 2-kilometer radius around the split-tooth rock. The results of the scan in the infrared spectrum were stunning. Bright red-orange spots flashed on the monitor screens against the cold blue background of the night jungle. These were abnormal heat signatures that could not be of natural origin. The thermal imagers clearly outlined the contours of the hidden infrastructure. The heat sources were located underground, but powerful ventilation systems released hot air to the surface, creating thermal torches invisible to the eye, but obvious to sensors. The nature of the heat radiation indicated the presence of underground rooms, working generators, and probably refrigeration units. Moreover, 500 meters from the main heat spots, vegetation analysis showed an unnatural linear structure. The trees there were shorter, and the color of the leaves in the spectral analysis was different from the surrounding forest. It was the same camouflaged runway that Emily had been talking about. The nets of live vines hid it from visual observation, but they couldn't fool the chlorophyll analysis. The picture came together. This was not a temporary poacher's camp or a small-scale drug lab. In the depths of the Peruvian jungle, under the noses of the authorities, a high-tech industrial complex was operating, protected by nature itself. The coordinates were confirmed, and the target was identified. Ethelgard Biopharma handed over the data package to the special services, realizing that the time for diplomacy was over. A bold red dot appeared on the map, and it throbbed like an inflamed wound. But when the satellite made another round and transmitted updated data, the analysts noticed movement on the runway. A plane was preparing to take off, and no one knew what cargo it was going to carry this time. The intelligence package collected by Ethelgard Biopharma's analysts landed on the desk of the leadership of Durandro, the elite anti-drug unit of the Peruvian National Police, on the morning of September 16, 2016. The information was so explosive that advisors from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, known as DEA, were immediately brought in to plan the operation. The decision was unequivocal. No ground reconnaissance that could give away the presence of special forces. Only a massive surprise airstrike capable of paralyzing the enemy before he could destroy evidence. The operation, codenamed Black Scalpel, began at dawn on September 20, 2016. At 5:30 in the morning, a formation of 4 Mi-17 transport and combat helicopters took off from the Mazamar Air Base. They carried 32 members of the Sinchis assault group, armed with automatic rifles and stun grenades. Their target was a square in the jungle near the Split-Tooth Rock, which had been considered uninhabited until then. The flight lasted 40 minutes in radio silence at extremely low altitude to avoid detection by possible cartel observers. When the roar of the rotors broke the morning silence over Surgeon's base, the surprise effect was only partially effective. The camp's warning system, based on perimeter motion sensors, gave the militants a few precious minutes of head start. When the first cables flew from the helicopters to the ground, the camp had already turned into a swarming beehive. The drug traffickers, realizing that they had been exposed, acted according to a pre-rehearsed liquidation protocol. They did not try to save the goods. Their priority was to destroy the infrastructure. The special forces who landed on the runway and rooftops saw people in camouflage pouring gasoline on wooden barracks and bunker entrances. The fire broke out instantly, kicking up columns of black, greasy smoke that mingled with the jungle fog. The battle was fierce and chaotic. The cartel's guards, equipped with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades, put up a fierce fight, realizing that they would not leave alive. The firefight at a distance of less than 50 meters lasted about 20 minutes. The bullets destroyed equipment, pierced barrels of fuel and chemicals, turning the camp into a burning hell. The special forces advanced meter by meter, using fire suppression tactics. During the assault, 8 militants were killed. Their bodies remained lying at the entrances to the burning buildings, which they did not have time to completely destroy. When the shooting subsided, the assault group commander received a report from a sniper in the helicopter. He noticed movement in the sector near the river. A man whose description matched the main target was trying to leave the base unnoticed. The leader of the group, known as El Cirujano, was not going to die for his goods. He took advantage of a secret underground tunnel, the entrance to which was disguised as an ordinary water well. The tunnel led to a disguised pier on the bank of a tributary, where a speedboat was waiting for him. However, the escape plan was foiled. A Durandro interception team, planted outside the perimeter, blocked the exit. The surgeon was taken alive. He did not resist when they put him face down in the mud. There was no fear in his eyes, only cold calculation and anger. While one part of the group was transporting the detainee, the other began to inspect the surviving premises. The fire was localized, preventing it from reaching the main concrete bunker, the entrance to which was protected by a steel door. When the sappers blew up the lock and the special forces went inside, they expected to see a weapons warehouse or mountains of cocaine. But what was revealed to their eyes in the light of tactical flashlights made even the hardened soldiers stop at the threshold. This room was radically different from the dirt and chaos of the outside world. Absolute eerie sterility reigned here. The walls were lined with perfectly white tiles that sparkled dazzlingly in the rays of the lanterns. The air was cool and dry, thanks to a powerful air conditioning system powered by a separate generator. In the middle of the room stood not a table for packaging drugs, but a modern, high-tech operating table with a hydraulic drive and limb restraints. Hanging over the table was a massive shadowless surgical lamp, equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars that looked absolutely surreal in the heart of the wild jungle. Along the walls were glass cabinets filled not with drug precursors, but with sterile instruments, scalpels, clamps, dilators, and ventilators. On the floor, near the drainage system, the operatives noticed brown stains that someone had tried to wash off but hadn't managed. It was not just a laboratory, it was an assembly line. Emily Clark's words about a high-tech business on human bodies were confirmed in the most terrifying material way. Here, underground, people were dismembered with the same indifference as a butcher would handle carcasses. The operatives, moving deeper into the complex, found a door in the back of the operating room. It did not lead to an exit, but to a narrow corridor that ended in a gateway. Behind it was a path leading to a deep ravine hidden by dense shrubbery, and it was from there, from the darkness of this ravine, that the wind carried a heavy, sweet smell that even the smoke from the fire could not interrupt. When the smoke from the fire set by the militants cleared, and the perimeter of the base was completely cleared by the special forces, the second wave of specialists entered the complex. These were not soldiers, but criminalists and forensic anthropologists dressed in biological and chemical protection suits. Their work began where the sterile linen of the underground operating room ended, behind the back door of the medical unit, where a narrow path trampled in clay led down into a deep, natural ravine hidden by a dense tangle of vines and ferns. What the experts saw at the bottom of this ravine made even experienced pathologists stop to catch their breath through respirator filters. This place was not just a landfill, it was a mass grave that had been used for years. The air here was so saturated with chemical fumes that the gas analyzers began to sound alarms on the way in. The soil in the ravine was saturated with a mixture of kerosene, quicklime, and concentrated acid, substances that the cartel used not only to produce cocaine, but also to dispose of the biological waste of their gruesome trade. The excavations lasted 3 days without a break. The work was complicated by the fact that the aggressive chemical environment almost completely destroyed the soft tissue, turning the contents of the pit into a homogeneous, toxic mass. However, the bones, although damaged by the acid, were preserved. As forensic anthropologists began to piece together this horrific puzzle, it became clear that Emily Clark's testimony was not the ravings of a traumatized mind, but a documented, accurate chronicle of hell. The first identified body was that of Michael Chen. He was found under a layer of construction debris. The condition of the skeleton was horrifying in its medical specificity. Experts recorded traces of cuts on the ribs and spine, made not with a machete or an axe, but with a high-speed surgical saw. The nature of the injuries left no doubt. The body had been opened professionally. An anatomical analysis of the cavities confirmed Emily's words. The victim was missing both kidneys and a significant part of the liver. The organs were removed with jewelry-like precision, which is impossible in the field without the appropriate skills and equipment. It was not a murder in the heat of the moment. It was the slaughter of a donor. The next discovery that finally cemented the case's status as one of the most brutal crimes of the decade was the remains of Sarah O'Neill. Her body lay a little further away, in a sector that was less affected by the lime. The forensic expert who conducted the initial examination at the site noted in the report the absence of eyeballs and heart. The chest was opened using a special retractor, the traces of which were clearly imprinted on the bone tissue of the ribs. The nature of the cuts on the vessels, which could be examined on the surviving tissue fragments, indicated that the operation was performed by a person with deep knowledge of transplantation. Sarah had been taken apart as a sophisticated mechanism to sell her heart and eyes on the black market to a customer who was probably waiting for the shipment in a clinic on the other side of the continent. A completely different picture emerged when David Ross's body was exhumed. He was found at the very edge of the ravine, separately from the others. His skeleton had no traces of surgery. David did not die on the operating table. His death was much slower and more painful. His body was in the fetal position, a typical position for a person dying of unbearable pain and cold. The forensic examination revealed numerous fractures, 8 broken ribs, a shattered tibia, and a crack in the base of the skull. These were the signs of the brutal beating Emily had described. He died in a cage, physically broken but not subdued, left to rot alive as punishment for his attempted rebellion. The remains of the 5th member of the group, Jason Torres, were not found in the pit. Investigators returned to the runway, guided by the testimony of the survivor. In a dense fern thicket, just 10 meters from the edge of the concrete pavement, the metal detector responded to a belt buckle. Jason lay where he had fallen a year ago. His skeletal remains were almost merged with the ground, with vines sprouting through his chest. The entry wound in his skull confirmed the version of execution by a shot to the back of the head. Nature had done its job in a year, but a 9mm cartridge case found nearby became a mute witness to that first act of tragedy. But the biggest discovery awaited the investigators not in the pit with the bones, but in an inconspicuous metal cabinet found in the ruins of an administrative building that the militants had not managed to burn to the ground. The safe was broken into with a hydraulic tool. There was neither money nor drugs inside. The archive of death was kept there. The operatives pulled out several plastic containers tightly packed with documents. These were passports. Dozens of passports. Blue, red, green covers from different countries. Among them were the documents of tourists from Germany, France, and the United States of America, who had been listed in Interpol databases as missing in the Amazon region for the past 5 years. Next to them were crumpled ID cards of local villagers, Peruvian migrant workers, and even the documents of 2 humanitarian mission volunteers who had lost contact with them back in 2013. Each passport was someone's life interrupted in this cursed place. The Ethelgard group was not an accidental victim, and not the surgeon's first prey. They were just another batch of raw materials in a monstrous assembly line that had been operating for years under the cover of the impenetrable jungle. The discovery of the passports turned the case of the murder of the research team into a serial crime investigation of international proportions. When the investigator was flipping through the pages of the found documents, a photo of a young couple in front of a waterfall fell out of one of the passports, and on the back was an inscription in a child's handwriting. "Come back soon." This simple phrase struck a nerve more than the sight of dismembered bodies. But among the pile of documents, the detective's attention was drawn to one particular black leather-bound notebook, with entries in English rather than Spanish, and the handwriting in it seemed painfully familiar to the experts. The trial of the cartel's leadership, which was codenamed the Surgeons Syndicate in Interpol's classified reports, began on January 15, 2017. The hearings were held not in Peru, but in the United States, in the federal court of the Southern District of New York, where the main accused and his 3 closest assistants were extradited after complex diplomatic negotiations. The security measures were unprecedented. The courthouse was guarded by federal marshals, and all participants in the trial, including the jury, were placed under a witness protection program. Emily Clark, the main prosecution witness and the only survivor of the massacre, did not appear in the courtroom. Her doctors and psychologists categorically forbade her to have any contact with the defendants, even visual contact, as it could provoke an irreversible mental breakdown. Her testimony was recorded on video in a special room in the clinic. When her face appeared on the big screen in the courtroom, pale, scarred, with eyes frozen in eternal darkness, even the defense lawyers looked down. Her quiet, monotonous voice, telling of the conveyor belt of death in the jungle, sounded more terrifying than any screams. This testimony, supported by the horrific findings in the operating room and the results of the examinations from the bone pit, left the perpetrators no chance. On March 14, 2017, the judge announced the verdict. The leader of the group, known as the Surgeon, received 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus another 120 years behind bars for international terrorism and human trafficking. He was sent to the ADF Florence prison in Colorado, a place from which there are no returns. Meanwhile, Ethelgard Biopharma Corporation launched a large-scale legal campaign to minimize reputational damage. The official version of events for the press was as vague as possible. The company's lawyers contacted the families of the victims, David Ross, Michael Chen, Sarah O'Neill, and Jason Torres. They were paid huge compensation, amounting to millions of dollars. However, this money came at a price. Relatives were forced to sign strict non-disclosure agreements. Any information about the real purpose of the expedition, the search for rare alkaloids, and the fact that the company knew about the risks of working in the red zone was buried under the label "commercial secret." The scandal was extinguished with money before it could flare up. The fate of Emily Clark herself was tragic, although she is formally considered to have been rescued. After the investigation was completed, she was transferred to a closed medical facility in Vermont. This is an elite psychiatric clinic located in the deep woods, away from prying eyes. She lives there under an assumed name, and her whereabouts are known only to a narrow circle of people from the corporation's security service and her treating doctors. Her physical wounds have healed, but left indelible marks. Emily has undergone 7 complex plastic surgeries to remove the deep scars on her face and body left by torture and tropical ulcers. The surgeons managed to partially restore her appearance, but they were powerless against the effects of chemical burns on her head. Due to the aggressive chemicals she was doused with in the camp and the deep injuries to her hair follicles, her hair has not recovered. She is forced to wear wigs all the time, carefully hiding the smooth, scarred skull underneath, which reminds her of the hell she experienced in the mirror every morning. Her psychological state remains consistently difficult. Emily suffers from a severe form of agoraphobia. She is panicked by open spaces. She does not go outside her room and the clinic's small courtyard, which is enclosed by a high fence. Any noise that resembles the hum of a generator or the sound of an airplane engine causes her to have an uncontrollable shaking attack. But the worst comes at night. She never sleeps in the dark. She keeps a bright light on in her room around the clock because the darkness is filled with ghosts of the past. For all these years, Emily Clark has not given a single interview to journalists. The only comment she allowed to be transmitted through her lawyer for a documentary book about cartel crimes was short and poignant. In it, she said, "The jungle does not kill. People hiding in the jungle do. And they took away not only my friends, they took away my soul, leaving only an empty shell that can still breathe." As for the place where this tragedy took place, the area of the Inambari River tributary has changed forever. The surgeon's base was completely destroyed by Peruvian army sappers, and the entrances to the underground tunnels were blown up and filled with concrete. Now this territory is part of a special control zone and is regularly patrolled by military boats and drones. Officially, there is no one there. Nature is slowly absorbing the ruins, covering the burnt concrete with a layer of moss and vines. However, local residents, fishermen, and guides from the surrounding villages still bypass the area on the 10th Road. The Split-Tooth Rock has acquired the status of a cursed place in their folklore. They claim that the land there is poisoned with blood and pain, and that no animal settles within 3 miles of the former camp. And the bravest ones, who risked approaching the ruins at night, tell terrible things. They say that when the wind blows from the side of the ravine where the pit of bones once was, you can hear not the rustling of leaves, but muffled screams and pleas for help that do not subside even years after the last perpetrator has left the land.